Starting in the late 15th century, French and British expeditions explored, colonized, and fought over territory in what we now know as Canada. Sadly, the indigenous people and the societies that lived in these lands were not only ignored, but were brutally pushed out of their lands, in a sense being a cultural genocide where the British had colonized their lands. The indigenous people of Canada were fooled into signing treaties with the British, practically handing over their lands without even knowing so. The indigenous people of Canada were treated poorly and had their lands, heritage, and rights all stripped away by the British, who simply decided to seize control over their lands that they had just stepped foot on, disregarding the nations of people who have lived there for nearly a millennium. The effects this had on the First Nations of Canada can still be felt closely in their communities till this day. The struggles that were faced by their ancestors is evidently still well and alive in the indigenous societies and reserves. For example, high suicide rates within First Nation communities and reserves can easily be linked all the way back to the colonization of these people's lands. The indigenous male suicide rate of 126 per 100,000 and the female suicide rate of 35 per 100,000 is staggeringly much higher than the non-indigenous males of 25 per 100,000 and females of 5 per 100,000. The Center for Suicide Prevention released an article explaining that historically, suicide was a very rare occurrence amongst the First Nations and Inuit. It was only after contact with Europeans and the subsequent effects of colonialism that suicide became prevalent. The effects of colonization and forced assimilation remain, causing accumulative stress and marginalization within the First Nations population. These effects can be passed onwards from one generation to another, dubbing this pattern as intergenerational trauma. Many members of native reserves are closely related and share the same social predicaments. The impact of a single suicide is often felt by the entire community. Because of the closeness of the residents, there is a greater risk of a contagion effect leading to a cluster of suicides. The greatest issue regarding high suicide rates within indigenous communities is the cycle in which the issue of suicide never seems to fade away. Suicide rates among Inuit youth are among the highest in the world at 11 times the national average. The ripple effect of trauma is powerful in small, close-knit Aboriginal communities, possibly accounting for the suicide clusters. In Classify's song Powerless, a lyric vividly describes how these suffering Indigenous groups of Canada are feeling. The people feel powerless, and the mothers feel powerless, and the fathers feel powerless. The Canadian government is lacking its responsibility of providing care to all First Nations. The rising number of First Nations suicide attempts, such as last year where dozens of people, many of them being children, attempted suicide in Ontario's Attawapiskat First Nation, followed by a string of 6 youth suicides in northern Saskatchewan, is not being handled properly by our government. Charlie Angus, the NDP's former Indigenous Affairs critic and a possible contender for that party's leadership, said the government's continually response to clusters of suicides that make national news with short-term solutions, only for the cycle to start all over again. The biggest issue facing our government is the fact that they are failing to keep track of how many children are receiving the mental health support that they need. The programs being run for Indigenous suicide prevention have many flaws and are not creating the impact and reform needed. For example, children and families on reserves were often referred to provincially run programs that require them to travel far for treatment. These programs were often not equipped to deal with trauma or are culturally safe. The situation has become so dire that some families have even given their own children up to child welfare officials in order to get the mental health services they need. The biggest concern is the fact that the government's responsibility to take care of its Indigenous population and to take stronger measures to ensure that these high suicide rates decrease. Health Minister Jane Philippet, in her testimony, called the high rates of suicide in Indigenous communities a public health crisis that has its roots in long-standing social inequity in colonialism, racism, assimilation, residential schools, intergenerational trauma, poverty, and so many more issues. Some efforts were put forth by our government in an attempt to decrease the high suicide rates, yet more is needed to be done. For example, in October of 2016, the 24/7 crisis line was launched for First Nations and Inuit people to provide culturally sensitive counseling. The Liberal government also earmarked $71 million for First Nations child welfare in March, but an NDP motion put the need at $200 million. Childhood experiences are major suicide factors such as sexual abuse, witnessing domestic abuse, parental separation, and living with substance abusing, mentally ill, or criminal household members. Intergenerational trauma, such as that associated with Indian residential schools, is among the key factors behind elevated rates of suicide behavior. Only by tackling the young generation of Indigenous children's poor quality of life and trauma will the cycle of high suicide rates vanish. On a personal level, we as Canadians should be aware of the struggle facing our Indigenous population and keep the conversation open, in order for the crisis to not be ignored or forgotten. It is our duty to help the First Nations of Canada, since it is our ancestors' demonizing acts that has led them here.